Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military doctrine, military history, and the practices of great military leaders, all by way of distilling lessons that we can use in order to build our businesses and professional practices. So this is my way as a veteran to give back to my fellow citizens, all of you, for the support that you gave and continue to give to the U.S. military over the last, 20 years plus that I started in the military in 2006. So we in the military do a tremendous amount of training. It costs billions upon billions of dollars every year. And I think there are numerous lessons that we can take. Both the military as a good example and as also as an example of what not to do. So, and in fact, on that note, today I'm going to be talking about taking effective action. And this is an area where historically, on the strategic scale, oftentimes the United States military has been, shall we say, behind the curve. So if you are engaged in the study of military history at all, you probably have heard the accusation that the military tends to fight the last war. And that is certainly in the 20th century and the very beginning of the 21st century, that unfortunately has generally been the case. And I'm just going to go through 5 examples that to sort of demonstrate my point and to bring out some ideas then that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So starting with the first war that the United States fought in the 20th century, World War I. So it was a situation where, for those of you who have watched other episodes, I've talked about World War I. The United States actually got into World War I late in the game. So we didn't enter World War I until April of 1917. The war had already been going on for 2.5, almost 3 years, I think, at that point. And the way that the doctrine that General John Pershing, who was the commanding general of the American Expeditionary Force that went to Europe to fight with the Allies, was, interestingly enough, in a way, ahead of its time almost. So by the time America entered World War I, it had bogged down into trench warfare. So you had each side, the Central powers and the Allied powers had dug in, across a wide front, and there was this whole no man's land in between, covered in barbed wire, and periodically there would be attacks where one side would rise up from the trenches and attack the other side. Usually it was preceded by an artillery bombardment. And the reality was, this was the first time that America fought in a war where there were the kind of technology of war was so massively destructive. So while Gatling guns had existed in the 19th century, and there were cannons, I mean, there was nothing prior to World War I that the United States fought in with the kind of artillery firepower, with the use of gas warfare, with the use of machine guns that could just lay down a blanket of fire that would literally mow down entire platoons and companies that were attacking. And in fact, toward the latter part of the war, there were also the introduction of tanks, which was not a huge impact technologically in World War One, but it was starting. One could already see that it was starting to be so, and the tactics of I should say the strategy of the American Expeditionary Force was one of the rifle and the bayonet were, paramount, and a force well trained in the use of a rifle, which was a single shot rifle basically, and a bayonet, would dominate the battlefield, even in the face of machine guns, artillery, mustard gas, all these things, and clearly that was not the case. And so over the 18 months or so that the United States was involved in World War One, there had to be, and there was a change in the strategy that the field commanders used, and the ones who were most successful were the ones who, in general, learned from France and England, who had been fighting already for several years, in terms of laying down artillery bombardments prior to an advance, flanking machine gun positions in order to take them out, not trying to attack them in a frontal assault where your men would be killed. So the strategy and the operational level of World War One had to change. It actually changed relatively quickly, and I'm actually working to get Ryan Gottfried on the show as a guest, because he wrote an entire book on this topic, and I think it would be great to have his depth of knowledge to talk about this. But in any event, the strategy pursued by field commanders changed actually pretty rapidly, and adapted to the conditions, so that by the end of World War One, the United States had been very effective in helping bring about victory over the Central Powers. So again, the way things started and the way they ended, very, very different, because the United States, in a way, was still fighting, the Civil War, or maybe the Spanish-American War, which was not applicable during World War One. So World War II, now, interestingly enough, World War II in some ways reversed that dynamic. So the reason that Nazi Germany was so successful, especially in the early days and months and years of World War II, was they adopted what they called the Blitz, or they adopted what was called the Blitzkrieg, the lightning warfare. It was a combined arms way of fighting, where you had infantry, which is typical in an army, but it was combined with tanks and air support in a way that essentially overwhelmed fixed defenses. The so-called Maginot Line that France built, for example, it just overwhelmed them, and it allowed Germany, the German forces, the Wehrmacht, which means military. It's usually used to mean the army, but the army was the Hode. So the Wehrmacht, which included the Hode and the Luftwaffe, they overran Holland, Belgium, and France, and just overwhelmed the fixed defenses that in World War One would have prevented Germany from being able to do that. But because the technology of warfare had advanced, especially with respect to tanks and armored vehicles and aircraft. So, in World War I, most aircraft were biplanes. They were very lightweight. They were very fragile. They couldn't carry much of a bomb payload at all. And by World War II, so the Germans had the Messerschmitt, BF 109, I believe it was, and the Folkwaffe 190, both of which were extraordinarily uh, um, well designed platforms for the kind of support that was needed in the Blitzkrieg, as well as the infamous Stuka dive bombers. All of these at the beginning of World War II were very, very effective aerial weapons, and so the Allies in the early part of the war were convinced that fixed fortifications were going to protect them from a resurgent Germany, and that turned out not to be the case. As a result, the Allies were way behind in terms of effective tanks, effective aircraft, effective artillery, and were it not for America entering the war on the side of the Allies and really becoming, as it was called in the time, the arsenal of democracy, and really outproducing Germany, tens of thousands of planes, tens of thousands of tanks. So both the British and the French produced tanks, but it was really the Sherman tank that was produced in such enormous numbers that provided the margin of victory, at least with respect to tanks, that was needed for the Allies to prevail. So although, for example, the German Tiger tank was a better tank than the Sherman, more powerful, better armored, etc., the fact of the matter was, by the time the Tiger was developed, the German economy could not build enough of them, and the number of Sherman tanks that were deployed by the Allies could just overwhelm them. As well, the planes that the Allies started out with at the beginning of World War II, so the I'm going up on the name of the British planes. But in any event, while they were successful in holding off the Battle of Britain, the reality was it took the P-51 Mustang and the Thunderbolt, probably the two best fighter planes in World War II, especially even taking into account the Japanese Zero, the P-51s, and the trying to remember the designation for the Thunderbolts. It wasn't the 40. In any event, these two platforms really were dominant in the air, as were the bombers that were developed, the B-17 and the B-24, primarily heavy bombers. Again, those really outclassed anything that the Axis had in Europe. Switching over to the Pacific theater for a moment, the F-6F and the gull-winged F-4U. These were the F-6F Wildcat and the F-4U, which was the Marine Corps, the Corsair that they flew. Again, completely outclassed what the Japanese had available in terms of ability, but also in terms of sheer numbers that the U.S. produced. uh, just overwhelmed them. But this was not where the United States was at the beginning of the war. The United States had to play catch up, and not only in terms of tanks and aircraft, but also in shipbuilding. So the ships that the United States started out with were just nothing like the type of ships that America ended up the war with. Whether it was destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, the capabilities of these ships advanced extremely rapidly during World War II, to the point where, again, the U.S. Navy's ability to lay down firepower to protect the sea lanes against the submarine predations of Nazi Germany just overwhelmed the Kriegsmarine and the Imperial Japanese Navy. But that was not possible at the beginning of the war. These were all realizations the United States had to come to as a result of Pearl Harbor, for example, as a result of losses in the battle for the North Atlantic, of merchant ships being sunk by the wolf packs of Nazi submarines. So again, the thinking in the beginning of World War II was fixed defenses will protect us, and as George Patton, arguably the most successful American field commander in World War II, argued fixed defenses were a relic of history. And he proved that time and time again through essentially a type of warfare that was very similar to the Blitzkrieg and the relentless pressuring of the enemy, not giving them time to regroup, and just continually pushing forward, and essentially overwhelming the enemy. So then, come forward to the Vietnam War. So in Vietnam, the United States had very much of a conventional war mindset that came out of World War II. It was essentially successful in the Korean conflict, or the Korean War, but then because the United States was fighting in a United Nations coalition with South Korea, with Greek, French, British troops, right? So, and they were fighting against essentially the North Koreans, supported by the Chinese and the Russians. So the Korean War was fought largely as a conventional war, in the sense of World War II style war. But then we got to Vietnam, and again, early in the war, it was U.S. military strategic thinking that we should do heavy bombing and we should do conventional ground warfare, and it didn't work with the North Vietnamese enemy and the Viet Cong enemy that was able to fight was really much of an insurgency and guerrilla type of warfare that just they would fight and then sort of melt into the jungle and disappear. So conventional warfare was just not going to work. And again, the United States had to change its tactics and build up counterinsurgency, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, the shift in strategy really never was successful in Vietnam, and that's why eventually, the United States withdrew from Vietnam, and North Vietnam took over the South, reunited the country under a communist government. So the United States was never really able to adapt to the kind of guerrilla warfare that was necessary in order to be successful in the Vietnam War. And this sort of continued into the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, where because of the first Gulf War being so successful, largely using what amounted to conventional tactics again, the United States was able to liberate Kuwait and essentially overthrow um, the um, the regime of Saddam Hussein, or not over. I'm sorry, liberate Kuwait. So that was the first Gulf War. So because conventional means worked so effectively doing that, in the second Gulf War in Iraq and Afghanistan, the idea was there that somehow conventional warfare would be successful. The problem was that although initially it was successful, a counterinsurgency developed, and this guerrilla warfare, not exactly the same thing as Vietnam, but similar problem. So the United States had to develop counterinsurgency techniques and practices in order to, quell what was going on. And for a while they worked, but I think in the long term, there wasn't the will to keep doing this and to make the investments, if you will, in time in order to truly transform the Iraqi and Afghani situations, in order to get rid of all of the resistance. So if one thinks about it, the United States occupied Japan for roughly a quarter century after World War II, and had very, very tight controls on what happened in Japan during that time. There was, in fact, attempts to raise guerrilla warfare in Japan post World War II. Less so in Germany. Germany was so badly destroyed in World War II. There was no real, significant, attempt to create an insurgency. However, in the case of Germany as well, it took literally decades in order to essentially turn Germany into a contemporary democratic republic, similar to the other countries in Western Europe, and the same thing is true in Japan. So there wasn't that commitment, there wasn't that willingness to expend resources in Iraq and Afghanistan to do that. Now, one might argue the cultural differences between the Mideast and South Asia were so great that it would never have been achieved. That's a good bourbon topic. Maybe that's the case, although certainly Japan is an Asian culture and very, very different than American culture. So I think that in the end, the issues with Iraq and Afghanistan is Americans, our nation, people, were just not able to, if you will, stomach the kind of all-out warfare that's necessary. That was what took place certainly in Germany and in the Pacific during World War II, and to a large extent in Korea as well. I think there was a certain kind of exhaustion with that kind of warfare, but unfortunately, that's what's needed in order to win a war. And so, because the United States went in with a less than solid commitment to prevail, indeed, the United States did not prevail in any of these conflicts in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And so today we still see this playing out. So we see a shift of, well, we need to focus on the war on terrorism, and then we see the rise of China and Iran, and Russia as being more conventional threats. So then we refocus on conventional threats, and how then do we handle situations like what we see in the Middle East, where we have the Houthis based in Yemen, launching missiles and drones at commercial traffic going through, the Gulf of, Suez Canal, and the Red Sea. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with a situation where we have these sort of low-level urban type conflicts in the Gaza Strip and in southern Lebanon between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah? How do we deal with in Iran that, at least until recently, essentially fought wars through proxies, through Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, etc., and has only recently, directly attacked Israel? How do we deal with a North Korea that is sending troops to Russia to fight in the war with Ukraine? Right? I don't know that the United States has a coherent strategy for that. How are we going to deal with China, with mainland China, if it attacks Taiwan or the Philippines, for that matter? Right? So, and one can say, well, how do you know how you're going to fight it until you know what you're fighting? And that is the challenge, right? So what do we learn from this then for our business lives? So I've raised a few issues that I want to highlight from a business and professional perspective. So you saw one of the themes that hopefully you recognize as I went through this sort of fighting the last war continuum, is that technological change required a rethinking of strategy, operations, and even tactics. Unfortunately, in many cases, there was not a recognition of how those technological changes would change the state of war, would change the battlefield. And so I think we've got something similar going on in the business world right now. So last night I had a conversation with my friend Michael, who I've mentioned many times, about AI, and how it might impact business, the workplace in America, how people work, how much labor is needed, what kinds of jobs will be more affected by AI than other types of jobs, right? This is a crucial issue for us in business to deal with, and to make some at least educated guesses and start experimenting with it, so that we're not left behind. We're better off being the businesses that figure out how to use the technology, and others have to catch up to us, than being the ones who need to catch up. So I'll give you an example in real life. This was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, I think, or maybe over the weekend. So there are a number of private space companies now, Blue Origin, SpaceX. There's another one in Europe. Ariane, I believe it is. If you saw the launch of SpaceX's heavy rocket, and the booster came back and they caught it in the tower so that it can be reusable, it will significantly reduce the cost of putting satellites, other things, into outer space. And that gives SpaceX a huge advantage in the commercial space market, right? So other companies are really behind the curve in terms of creating reusable vehicles for going into space. Well, this has been a long-term goal of SpaceX, and they've pursued it, quite strongly, if you will. And while they certainly haven't worked all the bugs out, by recognizing that this would give them a tremendous advantage economically, they have made tremendous strides in bringing it into reality. So these other companies now are going to have to play catch up. Now, will SpaceX's advantage always remain, for time immemorial? Well, history teaches us no, it won't. Eventually, companies stumble, and other companies overtake them. Look at IBM, for example. Having said that, at least in the short and medium term, SpaceX has a recognizable advantage in its marketplace because it dealt forthrightly with the potential technological changes that will make them a stronger company. And so that, works out, that delivers to their success. So all of us need to be looking at technologies that can help make our businesses more efficient, lower costs to our customers and clients. We should be continually examining these things, even if you're a solo entrepreneur, like a one-person business, right? We need to take the time to do that. Maybe work with other people who have similar businesses as ours, and talk to them about how do you think we can use technology? Join some kind of professional organization or some sort of business group, and that's a topic that should be regularly dealt with in meetings with other people. So keeping up with technological change is one way to take effective action. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is, and again, this was kind of a theme throughout, is recognizing where is my, or let me rephrase this. How will the enemy I need to defeat on the battlefield, how are they going to pursue their actions? And is what I'm considering on a strategic, operational, and tactical level likely to be effective in counteracting the actions that they're going to take, right? And again, we saw repeatedly that the United States was behind the curve in figuring out how to deal with it, and sometimes to the point where we essentially, lost a war, right? We had the, leaving the Vietnam War. What was it? It was withdrawal dignity with honor, or withdrawal with honor, whatever it was. Okay, fine. But, the fact of the matter is, we lost the Vietnam War. So too in our businesses, we need to be continually examining how is our competition looking to gain an advantage in the marketplace, right? That we need to be able to counter thrust, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to stick with the SpaceX example. The reason why technologically it's so beneficial to have reusable boosters is at least two factors. One is it's a cost savings. So not having to, create a new booster every time there's a launch means a savings in terms of the cost of materials and the cost of labor to do that. Now, the booster has to be refurbished, but if it's built properly to begin with, it can be reused multiple times, and the cost of refurbishing it for each relaunch is significantly less than building a new one. Okay. Now, the advantage there, of course, is if I can lower my operational costs, I can lower what I charge, undercut my competitors' prices, and get more business. So that's one advantage that reusable boosters have in terms of how SpaceX is approaching the market. And the second one is that by using a reusable booster, one can turn around and relaunch more quickly, because again, refurbishing that booster is a faster process than building a new one, right? So in theory, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but in theory, one could refurbish maybe, who knows, 2, 3, 5, 10 boosters in the time it takes to build one from scratch. Okay, so again, having a shorter turnaround time, okay, that does a couple things for us. One is it allows us to launch more frequently, and it lowers the cost, because I can launch more flights. So our fixed costs can be amortized over more launches, okay, which again lowers our operating costs overall, which allows us to lower our prices, okay? So the ability to launch more, to do more launches in a shorter period of time, economically makes us more efficient, not us, makes SpaceX more efficient, and therefore makes them more competitive in the marketplace, right? So for Blue Origin and the other companies, Boeing also is a competitor in this, at least in theory. Although the word is that they're looking to sell their space business, but for them, they need to respond to that challenge, okay? And if they just kind of keep doing what they've been doing up until now, it's like fighting the last war, because SpaceX has changed the nature of the competition in this private space race. Okay, so that's another aspect that we need to look at as we take lessons from the fighting of the last war. What are the strategies and tactics that our competitors are going to use that may be more nimble, may be more efficient, may cost less, may allow them to just somehow appear, kind of make a bigger splash, right? I mean, the fact that SpaceX caught that booster, it's not just that they caught the booster. It's when you look at the video, it's so amazing. It's just, you're like, wow, I think I want to work with these guys, right? So sometimes the advantage is almost ethereal in a way, right? But we need to be aware of those, and we need to deal with them as we look at how we need to alter our strategy, operations, and tactics. All right, and the third lesson that I think we need to take from fighting the last war is, do we enter into combat from the get-go? Are we going to commit to winning this war? Will we be able to sustain it to the point of victory? Right, and that's the lesson that I was talking about, or that was the issue I was talking about as I was looking at the wars we fought in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. That I think in many ways, America as a country, as a citizenry, just was not prepared for the sacrifices that winning those wars required. And those sacrifices were the willingness to do the kind of things necessary to win a war, to fight an all-out war, where there was going to be destruction. There was going to be a lot of death, not just the casualties of our own service members, but on the other side, essentially bleeding them to the point where they just couldn't go on anymore. That is essentially what we did in World War II. For example, with the atomic bombs, we showed Japan that we were willing to be essentially, in a way, more brutal than they could stand. And that is why Japan surrendered. Now, by the way, it was a bluff, right? Because we only had 2 atomic bombs that we were able to drop on Japan. We didn't have any more. It's just Japan didn't know that. And so that's why in the end Japan surrendered. So the commitment, so switching over now into the business realm, the professional realm, if we're going to launch an initiative, are we committed to seeing it through? Or are we committed to whatever our goal is, to reaching that goal? Okay. So one of the things that you can see in SpaceX is Elon Musk and his team, they are 110% committed to the mission of SpaceX. And I'm not sure that that same commitment exists, for example, with Boeing, that has had tremendous problems in getting their next generation of space vehicles going. They've had problem after problem after problem. Now, Boeing as a company has had a lot of problems overall, both in their space and their commercial aviation and their military aviation. So they've got but so one might argue, well, that's a cultural problem in Boeing, and perhaps it is. Okay, but I think there's no denying that when you compare SpaceX to Boeing, SpaceX is committed to spend what it takes, to do the work that it takes to reach their goal. And somehow that same commitment doesn't come through for Boeing. So in our businesses too, if we launch a new initiative, before we launch it, I think we have to have a kind of a heart-to-heart talk with ourselves, number one, and with our team members. Are we willing to see this through, to do the hard work, to make the sacrifices? Now, obviously in business, we're not talking about existential sacrifices like, somebody dying. I mean, I hope we're not in business, right? On the other hand, we may be talking about a lot of long nights, working in the office. We may be talking about a lot of people on our team really having to move out of their comfort zones and take on responsibilities that they haven't had before, learn a lot of new things, maybe fail quite a bit on the way to finding the success, the path to the success, that we need for our organization. All of those things can be really difficult for people to deal with, especially if we have a company where we've been largely successful so far, and now we're thinking of branching into something where our success is much less assured, at least as we look at it today. So are we really, in our gut, if you will, are we willing to make that commitment, okay, to fight those battles, and to make those changes that are most likely going to be most likely are going to need to be made in order for us to reach our objective, reach our goal, win our battle, so to speak, win our war, in the business and professional sphere. So those are the lessons of taking effective action based on not wanting to fight the last war. And I encourage you to think about these things. This episode, where it's broadcasting here at the end of October, we're heading into the holiday period. So I know one of the things I do every year, the last week of the year, is I essentially take it off and to spend a lot of time thinking about the lessons from the year that's coming to an end, and making plans for the coming year, setting goals and really committing to them, that is a process. It can't just happen on the fly, right? And that's perhaps another lesson that we can take from not fighting the last war. Is oftentimes the strategy is sort of just done on the fly. Well, this is what worked before, so that's what we're going to do this time, rather than sitting down and saying, okay, we've got a potential conflict brewing here. What do we need to be doing now in order to be successful in that conflict? And doing, I don't like this term so much, but perhaps some out of the box thinking, so that perhaps we come up with a strategy, operations, and tactics that will be successful as we enter into this new territory, as we enter onto this new battlefield. So that's my message for you today. I really appreciate you joining me. I think there's a number of people here on the live broadcast. That's always exciting. I hope you not just enjoyed the show, but really got something worthwhile out of it. Some real nutritious food for thought. Would love to hear your comments, your thoughts, good, bad. Links to our social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts on YouTube. So you can find us on LinkedIn, find us on X, find us on Facebook, find us on Instagram. Okay, they'll all be there, and tell me your thoughts. And if you happen to go to any of our social media, please do consider following us. And if you do go to YouTube, please do consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. That way, you'll always get notified when we're going live, or when a new show is available for viewing. So one last time, I thank you very much for joining me. Wishing you real quickly, tomorrow at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And I'm going to be talking about holiday party etiquette. Okay, as I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, we're heading into the holiday season, and I think it's a good idea to kind of review this issue, so that we can have not only as fun a holiday season as possible, but one where we really stay true to our values as individuals, and really show ourselves in the best possible light. So please join me again tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific time, for People Making Money. And then next week on Monday, 10 a.m. is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. My guest is Marianne Dean. Marianne is expert in dealing with the kind of conflicts that come up in the administration of a trust or estate. She's essentially spent her entire career doing that. Really looking forward to having Marianne on the show. I hope you'll join me. And then, of course, a week from today, we'll be back for the next episode of Business Lessons from the Military. So again, thank you so much. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage